Good morning, everyone. So I am sort of a history buff, but sort of a hacking history buff, and not necessarily in terms of like throwing out dates and rattling off facts in that way, but I'm very curious about how things started and how things progressed. Part of my job is doing threat modeling, threat hunting, and I think to be able to understand threats, you need to understand what's come before, and then you can try to extrapolate from that what's coming in the future. So this is a half hour of the entire history of ransomware from 1981 through till now. This is me. I work for Dharma, behind me here. I have a technical blog at Blue Tangle where I post detections and stuff that I'm working on. I run Real Hack History, which I have not been working on recently. I produce little YouTube videos on events in hacking history. And you also have to have your other hobbies, non-computer hobbies, to appear like a normal person at the bottom. So I like bowling, archery, and reading detective novels. So I had to give this whole thing a sort of a format, otherwise I would just put like entire encyclopedia entries on everything. So we have the history of the event itself, we have the context of the history, and finally, how did they do the ransom and how did they get the money? And this is always a very interesting part because you can see this develop and then eventually it's just Bitcoin. That's it. So I said we started in 1981. I'm starting on something that I know nothing about. The America's Cup, yacht racing, apparently. And in 1981, a package of floppy disks was stolen with telemetry from one of the yacht racing teams. And this was very important proprietary information that the yacht racing teams did not want to get out, because I guess it would give you maybe an advantage over their team or gambling, or I don't really understand it. I did some research. I still don't understand it. So essentially, somebody got a hold of these floppy disks with the telemetry data on it, and they were trying to ransom it on an Australian bulletin board. And I was able to find this out through looking at Risk Digest, which then had a reprint of a 1981 article. So a lot of this older digital history, hacking history, is kind of lost. You have to hope that someone mentioned it on Usenet, or in this case in the Risk mailing list. And so this is the ransom part here. So Computing Australia reported that the 17 disks were originally ransomed through a bulletin board called Interstate Connect, which is an Australian bulletin board apparently, with a hacker group called Tech Hack, which I think was involved in running that BBS, trying to make sure that they weren't blamed for the stolen disks. And there was a request for, looking now, did I not put the money on? I think it was at $7,000, $8,000. The ransom was never paid, and the disks, I think, were returned in the end. So that was 1981. This is one of the oldest cases of ransom data that I was able to find that wasn't stolen physical, like hard copy. So moving on, this is Joseph Louis Pop Jr., and this is the AIDS or PC cyborg Trojan. So essentially what this guy did, he was a World Health Organization, or he wanted to work for the World Health Organization. He was an evolutionary biologist, and he created a floppy disk that he labeled as sort of a digital questionnaire that someone could fill in, and it would try to extrapolate from that how likely they were to get AIDS, I believe. So he went on a mailing list for people who were AIDS researchers at the time, and in 1989 this happened. He sent out disks to, I think, about 2,000 people, and anyone who ran the disk infected themselves with the PC cyborg Trojan. And essentially what it did is it waited for the person who installed it to reboot their computer, originally 90 times, but he sent out other iterations of this to people. He kept on sending these disks out, and it would essentially encrypt parts of the actual file table itself, and would bring you up with a message that would basically say, the most serious consequences of your failure to abide by the terms of this license agreement, your conscience may haunt you for the rest of your life. So he had a flair for the melodramatic. He was arrested in the UK, and it turned out that he was severely mentally ill. So he was kind of like tinfoil hat, worried about people doing mind control on him. The UK authorities declined to try and basically prosecute him, and he was sent back to the US. The things that he did using the PC cyborg Trojan were actually able to be reversed, so luckily, because honestly, he could have destroyed a lot of AIDS research in 1989. That could have wiped out a lot of people's computers if it was irreversible. And this is just so he wanted people to send $189 to a post office box in Panama. After he was arrested, he said that he was going to put that money into AIDS research, which was a very strange sort of justification for this whole weird scheme of his. And this was all essentially because he was passed over for a job at the World Health Organization. The movie Hackers, we weren't going to get through this without the movie Hackers. So I thought about the whole plot of the movie Hackers revolves around the Plague trying to basically get away with electronic fraud in the company that he is the CISO at. So he creates this computer virus, which is represented on the screen by this sort of, I don't know what, digital avatar. And what this virus essentially does is if you don't send a payment, he impedes the function of internet-connected oil tankers. So, I mean, none of this at the time, this was all obviously a movie, but this was, in my mind, a sort of fictional representation of ransomware insofar as if they didn't pay the ransom, the ships were going to capsize. And this is actually from the script. Unless $5 million are transferred to the following numbered account in 7 days, I will capsize 5 tankers in the Ellingson fleet. So that was the method of basically getting a hold of the money in that case. 2005, Trojan PGP Coder. So this was the first sort of in the wild after the PC Cyborg Trojan. This was one of the first in the wild encryption ransomwares. Because obviously there's locker ransomwares, this is encryption. So in this case, this is the BBC at the time, breathlessly, a unique new kind of malicious threat which locks up files in a PC which demands money in return. And that's the date that I'm giving here is the 5th of May, so when it actually made the news. So PGP Coder looked for 15 common file types. This is something you'll see in a lot of ransomware, text files, documents, whatever at the time, 2005, and then encrypts them. A lot of this was drive-by sort of Internet Explorer vulnerabilities, and then malicious sites would basically cause a downloader to download this PGP Coder ransomware, and then it would encrypt your system. And yeah, so this shows you the ransom demands were originally $20 to $70 in rubles payable to a Yandex account, which is like sort of Russian PayPal, I guess, in a way. Later, decryptors would cost $100 to $200, so we're already seeing an increase in ransoms, and were payable through eGold or Liberty Reserve, which were both shut down by the US government because they were massively involved in fraud like this. Archivis used 1024-bit RSA asymmetric encryption, so this was an increase in the actual encryption of the ransomware itself. Earlier versions of ransomware, it was quite easy they used custom encryption schemes or weak encryption schemes, so it was easy for people to sort of reverse engineer. Although in this case, they made a mistake. They used a single 30-character password for everything, and that's it there, which undermined their business model because once that came out, nobody was willing to pay. And the other fascinating thing for me about this is that the ransom was paid via purchasing drugs from online pharmacies. So I'm assuming they got some kind of kickback for that. But that's, to me, the most unique method of payment other than maybe mailing checks to Panama. This is the strangest one to me. I looked for more details of this, what pharmacies, what drugs. I couldn't find any more, but I did look. 2010, Winlock arrests in Moscow. So this was a locker ransomware. And essentially, it was tests run in Russia by Russians. And this is before, I guess, the official ruling of, like, don't do ransomware in Russia if you're from Russia, or, I guess, don't commit crimes in the country where you are, essentially. So these guys were all caught. They were all put in prison. And yeah, Winlock would would not encrypt a victim's files, but would lock the entire computer itself and ask for a fine. So 2010 is when this sort of made the news, but it was running since 2007. It was just in Russia, so it didn't really make the Western press that much. And this is a screenshot of a very, very grainy Russian TV footage of if you've ever looked at ransomware sort of arrest footage, this is money and various documents and USB drives and stuff being sorted through. Developers of Winlock were said to have earned 1 billion rubles, although the estimates by the Russian authorities went up. It was like initially something like $25,000, and then it went up and up and up. And this demanded a text to a US premium rate SMS number. So you can see again, like the method of actually getting money from people is changing over time. And obviously that would then be traceable back to people if you were trying to withdraw the money from whatever sort of kickback scheme there. Reviton, the police ransom virus. So this basically was sent out drive-by malware again. This was looking for various security flaws in browsers. Could be email attachments, could be a few different things. And it would give you this fake message from whatever your local law enforcement were. So there was different versions of this release. There was a Canadian version, a US version, a UK version. I think there was a Europol version. There was probably a Russian version as well. And it was basically threatening you and saying, you've been caught doing bad things online. You need to send money to this account in this way. So this was also an early ransomware as a service insofar as the people who ran Reviton were also farming it out. So I think there was a Russian gang There were English people involved who were eventually arrested. There were people in Spain doing this, and there were various websites that were basically taking money to put the actual downloader onto their website, so that then they could infect their own customers, essentially, but, have plausible deniability that they weren't involved. And Reviton took money via MoneyPack, so prepaid credit cards. So they got around some of the earlier problems with people, not wanting to call a number or maybe not having their own credit card. I think this was also harder to trace as well, because it was basically a prepaid credit card sent to an account. So it was more difficult. And that was around $100. So we're still quite low in terms of ransoms. SimpleLocker, the first Android encryption ransomware. This is just interesting because it was the first one that actually targeted Android. And it's essentially the same thing. It targeted your SD card, and it basically tried to encrypt all of your files on there, your pictures, whatever documents you had. And this is a little section from, this was once again released in Russia, targeting Russian people, probably by Russian people. So this is a little bit of the ransom there, just basically probably saying, you need to get your files back. We've got them encrypted. It had a Tor onion-based C2, so it basically got error reports there. So if it failed to encrypt files, or there was some sort of basically quality assurance that it sent back data. That was it, though. And it targeted these file types. So once again, looking for file types that people would be willing to pay to get back. Victims in Ukraine were instructed to pay $22, £13 via Wannacry. And in case of no payment, you will lose all data on your device. Victims in Russia were charged about $30 in rubles. So still quite low in terms of ransom. SamSam. This is where we start to see more targeted ransom. So instead of just randomly infecting anyone who goes to a website or opens their email or whatever, SamSam actually targeted businesses specifically and actually operated within those businesses' networks to try and spread the ransomware as far as they possibly could. So this was an FBI alert. FBI wants U.S. businesses to help as cyber extortion gains urgency. And this is basically an alert from the FBI saying, this is targeting businesses specifically. This isn't like a random thing anymore. Sometimes TCPs closely resemble what we think of as typical ransomware techniques now. So brute forcing RDP, looking for privilege escalation, looking for lateral movement within a network, targeting parts of the network that are seen as important or more valuable to the people who might then pay a ransom. And in 2017, the largest ransom paid to SamSam was huge by the measure of the time. It was $64,000 via Bitcoin. And in 2018, it was thought that SamSam may have taken in as much as $6 million at that point. So we can see like a massive difference between the $20 ransoms at the beginning and where we are at this point. San Francisco Municipal Transportation Authority, which I thought was interesting because this was one of those that broke through to the media in such a way that it affected people in the real world in a very clear way. It wasn't a matter of some computers in a data center somewhere are encrypted. This was people could not get home via the San Francisco metro or whatever else. In the end, they just said free entry, and they just basically said you didn't have to buy a ticket. But for a while, they just completely paralyzed their entire infrastructure. And yeah, so they managed to, HTTP Crypto managed to infect 2,112 systems belonging to the Municipal Transportation Agency. And the message was, you hacked, all data encrypted, which, not what you want to see. The operators of ransomware demanded 100 bitcoins, which at the time was $73,000. And once again, you can see that increase in ransoms. You can see the targeted nature of this, that they figured these are people who would be willing to pay a ransom. Wannacry, had to include it. It's probably something that we're all aware of, we've all heard of, we're all familiar with. So this is a report from the time. By Friday evening, the ransomware had spread to the United States and South America through Europe and Russia, though Europe and Russia remained the hardest hit. According to security researchers' malware hunter team, the Russian Interior Ministry said about 1,000 computers have been affected. And this is just a shot of the ransom message that you would get up on your screen. So Wannacry spread to an estimated 300,000 computers. So this, in the time it took before the kill switch was put on, basically by Marcus Hutchins registering a domain, it managed to infect a massive amount of computers. And it used stolen NSA exploit Eternal Blue, which enabled it to spread basically like a worm. Wannacry demanded a payment of about $300 in Bitcoin, and this goes back to the earlier payments that we saw that were basically predicated on random people being infected. So the ransoms are lower. They're not expecting to necessarily get companies. It could be just random people or people who wouldn't have the funds to pay otherwise. And the message was, you have not so enough time. There were 3 hard-coded Bitcoin addresses which were used to receive the payments from victims. BitPayer. This is interesting because this is what I see as kind of the big game hunting ransomware starting. So BitPayer are basically an offshoot of Evil Corp or part of Evil Corp. And they started taking sort of Samsung's approach to specifically targeting businesses, but in their case, they started targeting bigger businesses, bigger organizations. And so this is part of their ransom message here. It may harm your business reputation, and the company's capitalization fell sharply. So the implicit threat there, and also that they're targeting businesses. They're not targeting like random, just normal people on the internet. So BitPayer hit actually Scottish Hospitals, NHS Lanarkshire very badly, and they'd been hit with Wannacry, I think, a month before that. And that was the largest sort of health department area, catchment area in Scotland at the time. So that really affected how they were able to operate. And the ransom requested of NHS Lanarkshire was 50 bitcoins, so that's £168,000 or $218,000. So once again, we're seeing a massive increase in the ransoms that are demanded. Allied Universal breached by Maze in November 2019. So this is a message from the Maze operators to Bleeping Computer. I uploaded some files from their networks as the data breach proofs. If they don't begin sending requested money until next Friday, we will begin releasing on public everything that we have downloaded from their network. So this is, to put some context on that, not necessarily the full origin, but one of the origins of the double extortion of ransomware. So you're not just encrypting files and not just taking files that you need to prove that you've accessed the network. You're actually taking files and then you're doing double extortion. So you're threatening to release confidential files, whether it's credit card details or people's personal bank account details or company secrets. And so this is kind of the origin of that through Maze. Maze were demanding 300 bitcoins from Allied Universal, which is about $2.3 million at the time. And yeah, I think they were paid at least some of that, if I remember correctly. Treasury Sanctions Evil Corp. This is, Maxim Jakubets here with his weird sort of, sports car that looks like it's out of Fortnite or something. Looks like a Fortnite skin, but Treasury sanctioned Evil Corp in December of 2019, and this is another one of those sort of big events in terms of ransomware, because after this, it was very difficult for Evil Corp to continue to do business in the way that it was. The companies that they would interact with to basically negotiate ransoms were told not to deal with them anymore. Once these sanctions came into play, companies were told by the US government, like, do not deal with these people, do not pay ransoms, do not transfer them any money. So once these charges against the various members, and especially the leader of Evil Corp went into effect, it made their business model a lot more complicated, a lot more difficult. According to US government indictments, Evil Corp is responsible for stealing about $100 million from companies over the last decade or so. So they've had various iterations. There was Drydex, there was BitPayer, which we were just talking about, and they're all sort of under that umbrella of Evil Corp. DarkSide and the Colonial Pipeline is another one of those events that people talk about or think about. This shut down the biggest US gas pipeline and was unable to resume operations for, I think, weeks afterwards. And this was nearly half of the fuel consumed across the US East Coast. What's interesting about that is they didn't actually damage any of the software that was running the pipeline itself. It was because the payment billing systems were offline. So basically, Colonial Pipeline was unwilling to give out gasoline for free. But it's interesting. At the time, it was sold as like they've shut down the actual pipeline itself. It was more complicated than that. It was business reasons. They exfiltrated 100 gigabytes of data, and that was also used for double extortion. And this is where the US government then put up a $10 million reward for DarkSide. So DarkSide ransoms were in the range of 200,000 to 2 million. So once again, you know, this is big game hunting. This is larger ransoms. In the case of Colonial Pipeline, it was reported that $5 million ransom was paid, but then DarkSide announced that they was disbanding. And this is probably because the exact same thing that happened to Evil Corp would happen to them. There would be some sort of situation where they would be under sanctions. So it was obviously a reward for their arrest, and it just becomes difficult for them to do business. Costa Rica declares a national emergency after Conti. So Conti went through an awful lot of issues in the last 2 years. They had various leaks of their internal documentation by one operator who was upset. Then someone else earlier this year leaked a whole bunch more of their internal communications, their internal documents. And so I think they kind of wanted to go out with a bang. So they sort of declared war on Costa Rica. So this was the Costa Rican president, Rodrigo Chavez, had just been sworn in and had to declare a national emergency basically straight away. Conti were dumping gigabytes and gigabytes of data from Costa Rican government agencies. They were asking for a massive ransom, and then they upped that, but we'll get to that in a moment. So Costa Rica's finance ministry, treasury, customs ministry, for a while they couldn't collect taxes properly. They couldn't pay government employees. They were having trouble with imports and exports because the systems that handled that were basically gone. So they had to switch to pen and paper to try and get around that. And it really made life difficult for them. After they were hit with Conti, they were hit with Hive ransomware, which hit their National Health Service. So basically people weren't able to get prescriptions. They weren't able to go in for medical appointments for a while as well. So Costa Rica really got it hard, and I think they're still recovering now. Conti initially demanded $10 million, and then when Costa Rica didn't pay, they doubled it to $20 million. So to my knowledge, none of that was ever paid. So if we think about the future of ransomware, I think the future of ransomware is pure exfiltration and extortion. If you've ever installed like a Mac OS update and found that something's broken on your computer, or updated something on your phone and found that something doesn't quite work properly afterwards, encrypting one system and expecting to be able to decrypt it is difficult. Encrypting an entire network of computers and expecting to be able to decrypt them in a time that would actually be useful to the people whose files those are is kind of crazy. It's amazing that anyone ever gets any files back, to be honest with you. There's times when people have paid ransoms and they've been given the decryption keys or the decryptor and they just don't work. And they've had to hire third parties to come in and basically take the decryptor that they were given and actually make a version of it that works properly. The Irish government, the Irish Health Service was hit with ransomware, and they spent months trying to get the decryptors that they were given for the ransom. Well, they claim not to pay a ransom, but they spent months trying to get those to work and they just couldn't. So this is Karakurt. Karakurt is an offshoot of Conti, and essentially all Karakurt does is they go into Conti victims that maybe it was difficult to encrypt the whole network for whatever reason, or it was difficult to get ransomware onto a system that they would need to. Karakurt go in, they target the file servers or wherever you're keeping valuable documents or data, and they simply steal that, and that's it. That's what they do. They don't ransom your actual files encryption-wise. They just take these, they put them on their leak site, and they say, hey, we've got a lot of your sensitive documents, sensitive documentation. So the way I see this going is there's going to be a lot more sort of an arms race around exfiltration, around ways of getting data off of networks quietly, depending on how closely network data is actually monitored, because a lot of people aren't great at doing that. I basically covered this already. And ransom demands from Karakurt have ranged from 25,000 to 13 million in Bitcoin, with payments typically set to expire within a week of first contact. So Karakurt are like Conti. They are not very into negotiating gently with people. This is very much like an extortion operation. If you don't give them the money, then your files are going to start being released. So that's my talk. If anyone has any questions, we have some time. I think we have 5 minutes.
So I'm curious, somebody gets in, right? One of the groups gets in, C2, whatever they set up, right? They start sucking data out of the file server, whatever it may be. How often, if you have any insight into this, how often is the data that they get back, okay, we're going to have the right privileges for certain file sharing, whatever we got back out. And most of what we have is information they probably don't care about, but we're just going to tell them that it's bad, that it's information they don't want us to leak. And we're going to expect payments, even though, how often do the actual teams, within those organizations, they don't tell, what exactly is taken, which is there.
So I've worked IR on a couple of ransomware cases. There was one where we were able to see that they used some PowerShell, red team tools to basically get the names of file shares and the names of the files within those file shares. And then they presented those to the client and said, we have your files, but we weren't actually able to find any evidence that they'd taken those files, and afterwards no files were actually released. It really depends. Some of this I think is bluffing on their part. There is some really interesting research that Orange Cyber Defense did around the types of data that different ransomware groups release. So some go after payroll data, payment data, stuff like that. Others go after more industrial secrets. You'll see groups on networks looking for, say, I've seen them looking for subdomains with confidential in them, or, you know, certain host names, certain file share names they'll look for that, like, you know, proprietary or secret, or like certain keywords that they'll look for. It's difficult to say, really. The one advantage they have in this case is a lot of people don't watch their network logs very carefully. Like, you can do DNS exfiltration, you can do HTTPS exfiltration. Like, there's certain data streams that have to be allowed in and out of a company. It's just a matter of noticing that, you know, there's gigabytes of data being shot at, you know, some random IP address that has never been seen before. Any other questions? I think we've got time for a couple more. Yes?
Just one about ransomware as a service. So, talking there, we kind of got to one here. Essentially, you've got one group creating ransomware, but then you're selling it off, you know, as a product. What's the sort of proliferation of that? Is that you expecting that to increase?
So that's another interesting thing. I was just reading about DarkSide have started using Lockbit, which is more of like it's a group, but also a brand of ransomware. So I think, and this is just me thinking about it, if there are more brands of the actual ransomware software, but less groups that have a specific identity, but they're all using similar generic tool sets, it's better for them in terms of avoiding DarkSide's fate of being hit with sanctions or hit with rewards or massive, you know, $10 million rewards for the person who's running it. So I think we could see a move to more like Lockbit might just become a brand of ransomware, and then different groups use it for their own purposes and make sure the payments go to them. But there'll be less of the actual brand name. You know, DarkSide uses DarkSide ransomware. Evil Corp uses Evil Corp ransomware. They may just start pooling resources and just start buying a sort of off-the-shelf tooling because it's better for them. It's more sort of plausible deniability. The other flip side of that, though, is that if you're giving these people $10 million, you kind of want to know who you're dealing with, and you want to know that you can trust them, because they're telling you that they're going to delete your data. They're relying on that sort of brand recognition and the fact that you go, oh, well, I've heard of these guys. Like, you know, hopefully they'll actually do what they say they're going to do. So it's kind of a flip side of, I think the Grok put it really well. He said you can be famous or you can be a criminal, but you can't be a famous criminal. And even in Russia, where they're like fairly isolated, if they leave Russian airspace, there was a guy who went to an island that had no extradition with the US. The US said to the island nation, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, we don't want an extradition treaty. We just want this one guy. And the island essentially said, okay, we'll give him to you. The guy thought he was safe flying there from like the Black Sea or whatever. So there is that real tension for them insofar as they want to be recognized. They want people to be afraid of them or to respect them or whatever. But also it brings a lot of attention. And I think Conti learned that this year as well. A lot of their members have been doxxed. I don't know how reliable those doxes are, but because of the data that was leaked, people have been able to sort of put things together, make connections within their organization, connect them to TrickBot, connect them to other things, so that there's a lot of sort of information that can get out there. Are we done? Yeah, of course. Yeah.
As far as like with the pipeline attack, wasn't the FBI I think was able to essentially hop back and trace different wallets and get run that type of attack.
Yeah.
How much of that do you think is going to, as we go in the future, like severely hammer kind of the TPP, these organizations, like to the point where like they second guessing themselves?
I wonder about that. I also wonder about the crypto crash, because a lot of these groups are sitting on what was billions of dollars, is now probably still a lot of money, but more millions of dollars. And if there's the crypto crash continues, they may not be able to shift that. So liquidity is going to be an issue for them as well. To be honest, the whole cryptocurrency angle, things change so fast that it's difficult. You know, you could say this exchange might get seized by the authorities or this money might get seized. It might not either. So it's difficult to say, but it's definitely an angle that I'm interested in my own mind. Whether they're going to ask for bigger ransoms or whether they're going to take more risks because they need to replace the money that might have been lost. So it's definitely something to think about.
Okay.